Hola amigos, welcome back to Real Tacos. Today I'm going to go through my current recipe for carnitas. Now carnitas are usually made with the entire animal, but because it's just me, I'm only going to start with a smaller roast. So today I'm going to start with a roast of fresh Ontario pork. This is a shoulder roast that's boneless. It's about 2 kilograms, which is around 4.5 pounds, 4.4 pounds. The first thing that I'm going to do is remove the string that came on this roast using a sharp knife. The reason that I take the string off is I'm not going to cook this roast as a whole. I find when I cook it as a whole in a slow cooker, it tends to fall apart when I pull it out because it's so tender, and then you lose the texture of the meat. I don't want pulled pork here. I want to have actual chunks of meat that I can still maintain the texture of the pork when I'm finished. So I'm going to start cutting this roast into smaller pieces. Now, these don't have to be cubed up. It doesn't have to be very small. The reason that I just cut it into these sort of larger chunks is so that I can get the seasoning on all the outsides of the pieces. I'll have a larger surface area. Plus, it allows me to fit it in the slow cooker better. And then you'll see when it's done cooking, because these pieces are smaller, I can take them out one by one and maintain the actual texture of the meat. So you'll see here that none of these pieces are going to be exact. They're not going to all have a uniform shape. They don't have to be like a certain dimension or square or anything like that. I just cut it up so they're all relatively even, but it really doesn't matter because this is going to get cooked for 8 to 10 hours in a slow cooker. And I'm just going to go through right now and have these larger chunks. So these look pretty good the way they are here. And I'm just going to go ahead and throw them into a stainless steel bowl so that I can season them in a minute. For the seasoning, I like to use one of these restaurant style shakers. The first thing I'm going to do is add a tablespoon of sea salt. Then I'm going to add a teaspoon of fresh ground black pepper, followed by a tablespoon of ground cumin. And last but not least, I'm going to add a tablespoon of Mexican oregano that I picked up at Menomex. So once I have them in the shaker, I'm just going to put the lid on and give it a little shake and kind of roll it around a bit just to get the seasoning inside sort of incorporated and mixed together. It doesn't have to be perfect. I just like to use the shaker because it's an easier way to kind of distribute it on the meat, as you'll see in a minute. So now I'm going to take the chunks of pork that I cut up and I'm just going to spread them around the bowl evenly here so that I have a nice even surface to coat with. And I'm just going to give them a liberal shaking of the seasoning. I am going to use all the seasoning in this container, so it doesn't have to be exact. I just find it a lot easier to sprinkle this than to try to dump it out of a bowl and then mix it by hand. I am going to get my hands in here eventually, as you'll see, to finish the job, but I just find this is an easier way to get it coated evenly. So I'll just flip them all over now that they got it on the first side. And then I'm going to be extremely liberal and just shake the rest of the seasoning on top of the meat here, flipping it around a few times to make sure I'm getting all the sides nice and coated. And like I said, this is all going to end up going back into the slow cooker. And I'm going to just go through here now, you'll see, and end up just shaking out the rest of the seasoning that's in the shaker, making sure I get every little last bit out of it. And I'm just going to put my hands in here now and just kind of mix it all together so that it does have a nice even coating and that the seasoning sticks to the meat and I don't leave any of it in the bowl. So I have the inner pot from my slow cooker, and I'm going to start by putting in at the bottom. I'm going to spread this around evenly. It's an entire white onion that I've sliced up into relatively thick pieces. The reason that I put it at the bottom is it keeps the meat from touching the bottom and actually getting burnt, because I find with slow cookers, sometimes they get really hot right on the bottom, and I don't want to overcook one side of it and have it be dried out. So I use this as a bit of an insulator. Then I'm going to dump in, I think I've got 3 to 5 cloves of garlic that I've just roughly chopped. Usually I like to put like 2 bay leaves, but these ones are a bit small and they're in pieces, so I put about 3 or 4 pieces in the bottom here. So now I can go ahead and take the meat that's been seasoned, and I'm just going to go ahead and arrange this in the bottom of the pot. I'm going to try to put it in there so that it all sort of sits at one level. I don't have any sitting, higher than anything else. And this size of roast fits nicely into this pot. I could probably fit twice as much in there if I wanted to, but for this recipe, I'm just going to use what I have here. And I'm going to put it all in together, and as you'll see, it'll fit nice and snug, and I can have it sort of at one nice even level. So the next thing I'm going to add is the juice of one freshly squeezed lime that I juiced. I'm going to go ahead and just make sure I get all the pulp in there as well. After that, I'm going to go ahead and add the juice of one fresh ripe orange that I squeezed. Just pour it in there. It'll all sort of work its way down to the bottom. Now, this next thing that I add, you don't have to add if you don't want to. There's already enough fat in this meat, but because I already had some of this rendered pork fat that came from some pork belly that I made the other day, I decided to go ahead and add that anyway. It's going to cook into it and just add a bit of extra flavor and a bit of extra fat. Nothing wrong with a little extra pork fat. And that's really all there is to it. I'm just going to go ahead and put the lid on, set the whole pot back in the slow cooker, and then set it to low and let it go for about 10 hours. After about 10 hours, I take the lid off, and you'll see that this pork is rendered out nicely. It's cooked fully, and it's extremely tender. I can tell. I usually like to put my finger in and just give it a little push. You can feel how tender the meat is. It's very, very soft. So I'm just going to let it sit for a little while and come down to not all the way to room temperature, but just cool a bit so it's not boiling hot. To practice proper food safety, you do want to make sure that you refrigerate this meat as quickly as possible once it's done cooking. In order to get the temperature down, because it's never a good idea to put hot food into a refrigerator, I took the entire crock from my crock pot and I put it in the sink with some water and some ice so that it could cool the temperature down very fast. And as you can see, I can easily pull this out. The meat is nice and cool now. And the other reason that I like to let the meat cool while it's still in the liquid is it'll actually retain a lot of the moisture. If you take the meat out while it's still hot, all the moisture is going to drain out and you're going to end up with dry meat. So you can see right now that this meat is actually solidified now. It's tightened up a little bit, but it's retained a lot of the moisture. So I just like to take it out and put it into this casserole dish piece by piece, making sure that I'm not breaking it apart. Once I have all the meat out, I'm going to take the entire dish and put it in my refrigerator so that it can cool entirely, at which point I'm going to wrap it so that I can have it ready to go for making tacos. The last step of this process is to go ahead and strain out all the juices that are left over from the roast. You're going to want to make sure that you get all of the fat and all of the juice that's left over. And do not, I repeat, do not throw this liquid out. You're going to want to use this later on for heating up the meat as well as adding flavor. A lot of the seasoning and the flavors from the juices that we added early on are still in here. So you want to make sure that you save all of this, including the extra fat, because the fat's going to help crisp up the pork later for our carnitas. You don't need to save the stuff that you scraped out of here. You can go ahead and get rid of that now, but you definitely want to make sure that you save these juices. So I'm going to just discard this and I'm going to take the liquid that's here. You can see all the nice fat on top and the flavor, and I'm just going to put that in the fridge for later. For my carnitas, I'm going to be making 3 different salsas. Now, I will say that my salsas might not be very traditional in the sense of how they're made in Mexico, but this is just the basic starting point for me. This is what I know so far, and this is kind of what I've gathered from everything that I've studied and understood so far. So, the very first salsa that I'm going to make is a red salsa made with some chili arbol, some chili guajillo, some garlic, Roma tomato, and some onion. The second salsa that I'm going to make is a green salsa. It is made with a fresh jalapeno, some onion, some garlic, a couple of tomatillos, and an avocado. The third salsa that I'm making is more of an experiment that I wanted to try. It consists of a habanero pepper, some garlic, some pineapple that I just grilled on the barbecue, which is actually canned pineapple, and another chunk of onion. To start the process, I'm going to start with about a third of a pot of boiling water, to which I'm going to add the tomato. I'm also going to add the tomatillos, as well as the garlic. I'm going to put the jalapeno in there, as well as the habanero. And I'm also going to add the onion pieces from all of the salsas. And then I'm just going to let this simmer for about 5 minutes with the lid on. While those are simmering, I'm going to toast my chilies in a skillet that I've put on the stove at medium heat. You want to make sure the heat's not too high because these will actually burn. So I've removed all the seeds and stems from my guajillos, and I've just opened them up and I'm putting them in the pan just the way they are. And you want to be very careful with this not to overcook them and not to burn them because they will have a bitter taste. So what I do is I put them in the pan and I just use a spatula to kind of press them into the pan so that they actually get an even distribution of heat. And you'll see they'll actually start to blister. You don't want them to actually turn brown or black, but you want to see this blistering because what that does is it releases the oils that are inside the chili and it awakens a bit of the flavors, so they actually taste a little bit better. You'll see on the outside, I'll flip these a few times just to keep an eye on them. I'm very careful not to burn them because I don't want to have that bitter taste. Once they're almost done, I'm going to go ahead and add the arballs as well. They don't take very long at all to toast up. You just want to have a little bit of a toasting on them. And again, you want to be very careful not to burn them. They will burn very easily and you can smell them when they're burnt. So if you do burn them, I would discard them and start over again. As you'll see, I'll keep pressing them into the pan, checking them occasionally and flipping them, and you'll see the actual flesh of the chili guajillos starting to actually blister. You'll see a change in color when I flip them over. Same with the arballs. You want to make sure that you're flipping them from side to side so that they don't get a burnt taste to them. And sometimes I can get in here with my fingers because I cook quite a bit, so I'm pretty good with the heat. But you do want to make sure that you're keeping an eye on this. You don't want to put them in and walk away because you'll end up with a bitter tasting salsa. And you don't want to go through all this work and have it not taste as good as possible. So just take your time. Don't have the heat too high. You don't want to have it too low either because then they won't blister. But you'll see that little bit of light coloring on the other side now. That's the blistering that we're looking for. It's starting to actually come out nice. The smell in the air is absolutely incredible. It just reminds me of Mexico. It's that you can see them actually blistering and they're starting to stick to the spatula. That's exactly what I'm looking for. So these chilies are starting to look pretty toasted, exactly how I think I'd like them. Just one last flip here to make sure that they're fully toasted. And the very last stage of this that I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the pan from the stove and I'm going to remove the chilies from the pan so that they don't continue to cook. The vegetables have been simmering for about 5 minutes now, so I'm going to remove the lid, turn the heat off, and I'm going to take them all out and put them back onto the plates that I initially had all of my ingredients separated for each salsa. I'm going to divide up the onions separately so that each one has about a third because they kind of got mixed together, but that's okay. I'm going to pull out the garlic, the tomato, and the tomatillos, and the peppers as well. I'm also going to make sure that I do not throw out this water because this water does have a lot of flavor in it, and I'm going to use the water for making the salsas as well. It's going to be used in the next step for soaking our chilies. So now that I have my hot water from the vegetables, I'm going to go ahead and add the chilies that I had set aside. I'm going to put the chili guajillos in as well as the arbols, and I'm going to press them down into the water so that they're all submerged and put the lid on and leave it with the heat off for about 20 minutes or so that they can soften up so that they blend nice and evenly. While the chilies are soaking, I'm going to go ahead and get started on the other two salsas because they don't need the chilies. So the first one is going to be our green salsa or avocado salsa, which is going to have some garlic. It's going to have the jalapeno as well as the tomatillos and some onion and some sea salt. Now, I usually use about a quarter to a half a teaspoon of salt depending on how big the batch of salsa is going to be, but this one does get a whole avocado, so it can take a little bit more salt, so it's a little bit closer to half a teaspoon. The first thing I'm going to do is put everything in except for the avocado and allow it to blend up so that it's smooth. One of the things that I really like about this salsa is that it is very cooling, even though it has a whole jalapeno in there. You don't actually taste a lot of the heat, you just get quite a bit of the flavor. But once you add the avocado, as you'll see, it actually becomes nice and creamy. So if you have something like a hot salsa, like our red salsa is a bit spicy, as well as the pineapple one has a bit of kick to it from the habanero, this salsa adds a nice contrast. So it actually cools it down. Or this is also a good salsa for somebody that doesn't like a lot of heat anyway. Or if you're an avocado lover, this is the perfect salsa for you. So now that that's blended up, I'm going to go ahead and scoop in the avocado. All of these salsas I usually like to make fresh when I'm actually making the tacos. They are good the next day, but I tend to find they taste better when they're not refrigerated. So if you're going to save them, they do have to be refrigerated, but when they're sitting out at room temperature, they do maintain their texture. Once they cool down though, they will all thicken up a bit. So you'll need to add a bit of water to thin them out to your desired texture. I don't like my salsas too thick. I like to have them so that I can actually put them in a squeeze bottle just to find it easier to distribute, but you can put them in a bowl and just use the spoon. As you'll see that once the avocado's in here, this one tends to thicken up a bit, and I will add a bit of water here and there just to thin it out enough so that it has that same consistency. The other thing I really like about using this as a salsa, it is a very creamy texture, so it does add another dimension to the taco as well as the flavoring of it. It tends to cool down any extra spice that's in there, and it just an all around one of my favorite salsas to make. And as you can see here, I'm adding a little bit of water to thin it out bit by bit. You don't want to add too much at once because you can always add a bit more water. You don't want it too thin. You don't want it really runny because then you'll have soggy tacos. So I just sort of thicken it up as I go. And even as it gets close to time to eat, if the salsa is a little thick, you can always add a bit of water because it's already nice and blended. And as you see, this comes out very creamy. And I'll tip the blender over here so you can have a look at that. Nice creamy avocado salsa made with tomatillos. The next salsa that I'm going to make is my grilled pineapple and habanero salsa. This is not a recipe that I saw anywhere or that I found when I was in Mexico, but this is something I just came up with on my own, and this was a bit of an experiment. It's the first time I've made it, and it actually turned out pretty good. I find that pineapple and pork go together really well. It's a traditional combination of flavors. Tacos al pastor is made with pineapple, so this to me was a way to add a bit of that pineapple kick to my tacos without actually having to have the pineapple itself. And the habanero goes really well with this because it gives it a bit of kick without making it too spicy. So you'll see that I added salt to this as well. And I also added a bit of juice from the pineapple. This was a canned pineapple, and I find canned pineapples tend to work better for this because they're actually a little bit riper than what we can buy here in Canada. Most of the fresh pineapples you buy in the grocery store aren't ripe, and they're not even fully mature, so they don't have the same flavor profile. I grilled the pineapple to add an extra dimension to the flavor. I find that by grilling the pineapple, it caramelizes a bit of the sugar and it adds a bit more flavor to the pineapple. So all I had to do for that was heat up my barbecue, and I just threw them on the barbecue just plain the way they are. A little bit of olive oil rubbed on the outside so they don't stick, and I just grilled it for a few minutes on each side. So you'll see here I just threw everything in the blender with a bit of the pineapple juice, blended it up till it was smooth, and it came out to a really nice consistency. And I like how you can see the little tiny bits of habanero in there because it adds some color to it as well. So I'm just going to give it a little bit of a final blend here, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's done. But this one came out really nice, and this was actually one of my favorites, so I'll probably make this again. So now that my chilies had been soaking for about 20 minutes, what I'm going to do is go ahead and make my red salsa or salsa roja. Now, again, I'm not sure if this is exactly how it's supposed to be made, but this is how I've been making it. And so far, I like the taste. I know there's some tweaks that I need to make, and I'm always looking for feedback. So if you have other ideas or if you see me doing something wrong, definitely leave a comment in the comment section below and let me know what I could be doing better. But this is what they look like. They've been sitting for 20 minutes. They've softened right up. I'm going to go ahead and put them in the blender first. That way they're at the bottom so that they get blended up nice and evenly. I'm going to make sure that I put them all in there. And I'm going to save the liquid as well because I'm going to use some of that liquid for adding to the salsa to thin it out as I need to. So I'm going to go ahead and add the garlic, the tomatoes, the onion, as well as some salt. This one I'm going to use a moderate amount of salt as well. I only use sea salt for these recipes, so it all depends on your taste. So you'll see I add the salt here, and then I'm going to put the lid on the blender and blend this up really well. Now, I know that not everybody has a Vitamix at home. I only use a Vitamix because of my restaurant background, and it's the only blender I like. I like the way they work. I like the way the container shape brings everything back down into the bottom, and I find that they work really well. But it does still take a little bit to get this salsa blended because there is some seeds in the arbols, and the chilies themselves do take a little bit to blend up so that they're nice and smooth. But as you'll see when it's done, this salsa comes out extremely vibrant, and it's got a really nice flavor to it, as well as it's got a bit of kick from all the chilies. So I'm just going to blend this up really well, and you'll see when it's done here how it turns out. It's absolutely delicious. Next, I'm going to get my masa ready for making tortillas. Now, I use maseca, which is an instant corn masa flour. It's made with corn that's been cooked with calcium chloride, and then it's been dried out and ground up. So this is an instant product, so all you have to do is put some in a bowl, and I add some salt to it. I do use a moderate amount of salt as well, probably like a half a teaspoon. I probably have about a good cup of this flour. I'm only making enough tacos for 2 people right now. And then what you want to do is add warm to hot water. So not piping hot, but not lukewarm as well, somewhere in the middle. And I add the water a little bit at a time to try to rehydrate this. It will take a little bit. I use a spatula first so that I can get the water sort of pressed into the flour. This is not like the typical flour that you have when you're making like a dough. So there's no gluten in this. So it doesn't actually form a bond or any sort of strains like that. All you're doing basically is rehydrating this. And you don't want to overdo it. You don't want this too thin because your tortillas will be sticky. And then if you don't have enough moisture in them, they'll be dry. You can always add more moisture, but you don't want to add too much to where you're going to be having to add more flour. So as you'll see, I use this in a stainless steel bowl with a heavy spatula that's able to take a little bit of force to it. And I just sort of keep pressing it into the flour because I want it to come out and start to form a ball so that I can start kneading it with my hands. Making tortillas is definitely something I've struggled with since my whole taco making journey began. Because I didn't grow up around this stuff, I really don't know exactly what the proper consistency is. Now, they tend to say it's a little bit like a wet sand type of thing, but I find that they need to be not quite that wet because they will stick. And if they stick, they end up a little bit harder to make the tacos with. But as you'll see, this has a pretty decent consistency so far. It comes cleanly off my fingers, which is kind of what you want. But now that I have that consistency, what I'm going to do is just start kneading it by hand. And I probably knead this for 5 to 10 minutes. If you don't knead it enough, what happens is it ends up just being like a reconstituted dough of water with the flour. If you knead it more, it actually becomes more of a dough where it sort of sticks together and it makes almost like a bond where it is more dough-like. And that's really what I'm going for here. So I found that if I don't knead it enough, when I go to make my tortillas, they don't puff up and they tend to be really dense and they're a little bit hard. The other thing is I'm still trying to learn how much liquid to put in these. So I tend to sometimes put a little too much, and then the next time I'll put not enough. But I find if I don't use enough liquid, my tortillas end up coming out a bit dry. What happened here is I felt that it was a little bit sticky after kneading it, so I added a little bit more flour, and then I just kneaded it back in. It's a lot easier if you start adding in a bit more flour now if you need to than after you've kneaded it for 10 minutes, because that flour that you add then won't be mixed up with the rest of it. And you want to have a nice consistent mixture here. So I just added a bit more. I scraped off everything from the sides and just continue kneading this. And you'll see that I knead this for quite a while here. I tend to let it go for, like I said, 5 to 10 minutes. You really want to work that moisture back into the flour, and when it's all done, I end up wrapping it up with some clear cling wrap and set it aside. And you want to do this ahead of time and let it sit for quite a while, like probably at least half an hour to an hour before you make your tortillas. You really want to give that corn some time to hydrate and absorb all that moisture back into it. And sometimes even then you'll find that it might be a little bit dry when it's done, so then you can just put a little bit of water on your hands and work a bit of moisture back in until you get the right consistency. But yeah, I'll just keep kneading this and kneading this until it's exactly where I feel that it's ready. Now that all the prep work is done, we can start actually making our carnitas. So I've taken a couple pieces of meat out of the fridge here just to show you what the consistency is like. It's firmed up on the outside, but it's actually super tender. Even that fat that's on the top there that I don't want to remove, that is actually rendered right down. And when it cooks, it'll actually turn into like a buttery consistency. So this piece here I'm going to take and just break a piece off. Remember when I told you that I let it cool while it's still in the liquid? This is why. When I open this up, even though this meat is super, super tender, and it's fully cooked, it's actually nice and moist inside. You can see that glistening. That's the juices. That's some of the fat and some of the liquid that it was cooked in. And you can see how it's nicely seasoned all the way around. The next thing I'm going to do is take a cutting board and a sharp knife, and I'm going to go along and I'm going to cube these into relatively medium-sized cubes. So they're about maybe 3/4 to an inch in size. They're not all going to be exact because the actual meat itself isn't exact. But I'm just going to cut them into pieces, being careful to handle them delicately because I don't want them to fall apart on me. I want to maintain some texture. I'm going to go through and cut them all up, you'll see here, and put them into a glass baking dish. You could do this on a sheet pan as well, but I like using glass because then I don't have to use tin foil or any sort of non-stick coating. And this is going to go under the broiler, so it's going to take quite a bit of heat, and these Pyrex dishes are great because they can take that heat. So you'll see here, I'll just cube it up, and I want to keep these in sort of, decent sized pieces. And the name of the game here is really surface area. The surface area is going to allow it to brown up and crisp up on the outside while still being nice and moist and juicy in the middle. And that's really the texture that you're going for here. If a little piece breaks off there, you don't have to worry about it. Stick it in there anyway. It's going to be equally as delicious. But you can see here, this meat is super, super soft. It just wants to fall apart on me. And that's why I like to cool it first in the fridge before I use it. If I were to take it out of the slow cooker and just try to cook it right away, it would really fall apart and turn into pulled pork. Once I have it cut up, this is what it looks like. You have nice big cubes of pork and it's ready to go. Each one of these cubes is a good size for a small taco, or you can break them into pieces and use them for if you want to put more meat in your tacos. But the next step is I'm going to take some of that juice that we removed initially from the crock pot. It has the fat on the top. I don't remove the fat at all. I leave it in there. And I'm just going to mix it up all together and pour it over top of this. What'll happen is the water that's in this liquid will evaporate in the oven, and it'll just concentrate the flavors even more onto the pork, and that fat will help crisp up the outside of the pork. I'm just using an electric oven with the broiler turned on high. And what I'll do is I'll take the pan of meat and I'll put it on the top shelf underneath the broiler. And what that will do is that'll heat up the meat as well as it'll start to crisp it. While the meat is heating, I'm going to go ahead and start making my fresh tortillas. I'm going to unwrap the masa that we made earlier that's been resting. And I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the wrapper here. And I'm going to start to make some tortillas. So in order to make tortillas, you're going to need a tortilla press. As well, you're going to need to take a plastic bag and cut 3 sides off the bag, because if you don't use a bag, this flour will just stick to your press and it'll never come off and it'll just make a big mess. You definitely need to use either like a plastic bag or some cling wrap or something, but I find like just taking a Ziploc bag and cutting off 3 sides, leaving one of the sides here so you can fold it, works perfectly. So what I'll do is I'll open it up, I'll take a small 1-inch size ball of masa, and then I'll press it out into a tortilla. Sometimes what you'll have to do is you'll want to press them twice. So if you take it out and they're not fully pressed down, you can just close it and press it again. But this is about the size that we're looking for. The pork has been in the oven for about 5 minutes under the broiler, and as you can see, it started to crisp up on the top. The liquid on the bottom is bubbling and starting to reduce. And because we took all those steps earlier on to make sure that we were very delicate with the meat and that we didn't break it up into pieces, we're able to take each of these chunks now, and you can see how soft they are. And I can just flip them over one at a time, taking the part that's already been browned and putting it into the liquid, that way it doesn't dry out, and then flipping them over so that the other side can brown as well. Sometimes they'll fall apart a little bit, but generally they tend to maintain their texture, which is exactly what I'm looking for. I want to make sure that when this is all done, I still feel like I'm eating meat. I'm not just having pulled pork. That tends to be overcooked tasting, and I find pulled pork is really dry most of the time anyway, so this is just turning out beautifully. The liquid's reducing. The smell is absolutely incredible. You can smell all the seasoning and the garlic that we put on these earlier when we made it, and that fat that's in there is just going to keep cooking down, and these are going to crisp up nicely. While the pork finishes in the oven, I'm going to go ahead and start cooking the tortillas. Now, this whole tortilla cooking process is definitely a trial and error thing for me. I haven't made a lot of these in my life so far, and it's been a huge learning curve, as this is not something that's very common up here in Canada. But the more of these that I make, the better at it I get, and I start to learn from my mistakes. So one of the mistakes that I made on this batch is in the very beginning, I started just dropping the tortillas onto the pan flat. And I find when you do that, you end up with a big steam bubble that ends up underneath the tortilla in the middle, and that part of the tortilla doesn't touch the pan and cook properly, and it becomes sticky. So you can see in the middle of that one there, it has an actual round part that wasn't quite touching the pan. So I've learned since then that what I do is I hold the tortilla in my hand and I just put one edge down and then sort of pull my hand out from under it so the rest of it rolls onto the pan. And I find that they cook a lot better that way. Once I put them in the pan, I only let them sit for about a minute or so, just till they sort of release, and then I give them a quick flip right away. It doesn't take very long. Usually the first time you put them down, you flip them, and then you let them sit for a minute or two till they actually start cooking. Once they're on the second side, sometimes they start to puff up, but I find that they don't always puff up until you flip them back onto the original side, and you have to give them like a little bit of a press in the middle, which causes them to sort of release. And then you have a pocket of steam inside the tortilla that causes them to puff up nicely and finish cooking. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for nice and fluffy tortillas, not thick, dense tortillas. So I just take my time and I do these one at a time. And as I take them off, I put them inside my tortilla warmer, which is just a holder. And when they first come off, I find that they're a little bit dry in texture, but when they sit in the warmer, they will actually rehydrate from the steam that they release, and then they all come out nice and soft. So I just do this batch by batch, one at a time. I press them out. I'm making small tortillas as well. These are probably 3 to 4 inches in size because I like them. I like my tacos a little bit smaller. You can eat more of them. They're easier to handle. And I just find that that's my preference right now. You can make them bigger if you want, but this way allows you to eat more. You can have different salsas on them. And if you're making different types of tacos, you can end up with, having more variety that way. So as you'll see here, I just flip them as I go and I let them cook and just kind of go through the motions. I usually like to make, 5 or 6 tacos per person per meal, and then depending on how thick you make your tacos, I like to use sometimes 2 tortillas for each one, which is very traditional as well. As you can see, the pan is starting to get a bit dirty, and that's because of a bit of bad technique and a bit of that. As you can see here, I'm starting to actually roll them on so they're cooking a little bit better. um, it's definitely been a challenge for me, and I'm always looking for feedback. So, Mexicans, if you can give me some pointers in the comment section below, I'd greatly appreciate it. I've just been doing this, learning from videos and learning from recipes and doing my best here, and they do come out good. They're better than anything you can buy in the store, but there's definitely a lot of room for improvement. I'm still trying to get the texture right. I'm still trying to get the amount of moisture, the temperature, all those sort of things, but for just a guy that's up here in Canada trying to figure this out on his own, so far they turn out pretty good, and I'm generally happy with the result. But like I said, there's always room for improvement, and I definitely appreciate any feedback that you can give me. This is a bit of a time-consuming process, and I did speed up the video so that it goes a little bit quicker for you, so you don't have to watch me make each individual one. But as you can see, it doesn't take very long. You just got to be patient. One at a time, just add them on. As they start to cook, you can actually move them around and add. Like, I could get 4 of them on here, but it's really hard to keep up with cooking them and flipping them as well as pressing out the tortillas. But you'll see by the time I get this done, I have a pile of them. My tortilla warmer is getting full, and it's almost time to eat. I got to tell you, the smell that these things give off just makes me totally miss Mexico. There's nothing like a fresh tortilla. Well, amigos, it's finally time to make some carnitas. It's been a long day of doing prep and making salsa and making tortillas, but it's finally time to put some of these together. So I'm going to take my meat and show you exactly what the end result is here. You can see they've browned up nicely on the outside. They got a little bit of crisp. They got some nice crust on there and some caramelization. All the liquid is rendered down to like a nice little thick sauce that's on them, so they're nice and juicy. And if you'll see here, if I give this piece a little squeeze, that it just wants to melt and fall apart. But it still has some texture of some meat, and it's not dry at all. It's got some nice moisture on the inside. So I'm just going to go ahead and grab some tortillas and put these together and show you the end result. I'm going to start by making myself 3 tacos. I do like to double up the tortillas like they do in Mexico. For each taco, I like to grab a chunk of the pork and just set it in the middle of the tortilla. And I'll use the tongs just to break it up a little bit so that it spreads a little more evenly across each tortilla shell. I'll see if I can get it to pull a better focus here so you can see the texture of the meat, how it's still juicy on the inside, but it has that nice crispiness on the outside. And the smell is absolutely incredible. The garlic with the bay leaves and the onion and the cumin as well as the Mexican oregano just smells absolutely incredible. Also, that fresh lime juice and orange juice that I added before we cooked it really gives it a nice fragrant quality as well. As you'll see, I did put my salsas into squeeze bottles, but you don't have to. For this first round, I'm going to put 1 salsa on each taco just so I can taste the difference, but you can use whichever one you want. I mean, you are, after all, the chef John of which salsa you want to put on. And finally, I'm going to top it with traditional diced onion, and it is a white onion that I diced up, as well as some fresh chopped cilantro, and I'm going to serve it with some fresh lime. And that, folks, is how I currently make carnitas. Thanks for watching.